Hi, everybody. Thanks for the wonderful showing today. Really appreciate it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about industrial control security, and specifically, we get a lot of questions about, hey, we're IT security people, and we want to make this move. We want to learn more about how industrial control security works and how we can learn more about it on a budget at home. So that's we're going to give you a really, really short crash course today. So I'm Lesley Carhart. I am a principal threat hunter at the Dragos Threat Operations Center. We do industrial control and critical infrastructure security specifically. And this is Mark, my colleague.
And you'd think we would have the same title. We do the same job. That's part of being a startup. We all kind of made up our own titles, and then we're trying to meld them together.
Okay, so today obviously we have two speakers up here, which is kind of unusual for CypherCon. I'm going to give you a crash course in ICS, like the 20-minute crash course, something we normally teach over a week. Rob teaches it in like a week at SANS, and we teach it in a week at Dragos training. I'm going to try to condense that into 20 minutes for you guys. So either I'm going to have to speak really, really rapidly, or obviously I'm going to omit some things and try to hit the highlights. If you have more questions, you can find us afterwards, and we're happy to chat. And then once I do that overview, Mark is going to take some time to explain ways that you can learn more about ICS, which is probably the meat of the presentation that you guys are really interested in learning more about, is how you get out there and start learning more on your own time or as an organization. Okay, so let's start out with a little bit of common terminology. And as ICS is a rather divided industry, full disclaimer, there is some contention about the definitions and the descriptions I'm about to give you. Different industries, different verticals define things differently. So there's going to be a couple ICS people out there, and I see a couple of you who are going to be like, I don't like that definition. And that's fine. I tried to make the most general definitions that I could possibly make, so that people who are just getting a grasp of the field and have no idea what any of the terms mean can kind of have a place to start. So let's start out with these big terms that we talk about when you talk about critical infrastructure security and the ICS, industrial control system security. So first of all, we have the broad-ranging Internet of Things, IoT. And that's like everything that's not a PC that's connected to the internet. We kind of know that as computer security people. We understand that's generally considered to be non-PC, non-computer, desktop computer devices that are internetworked. So that could be anything from a toothbrush to part of an aircraft. You know, it could be, there's tons of IoT devices in here. There's security cameras, there's wireless thermostats, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so then we have, more granularly, we have operational technology, OT devices. And that's a term that's used more commonly in some verticals of ICS than others. And generally, we consider that internet-worked physical devices that are involved in some type of kinetic operation. So whether it's a power plant or a manufacturing facility, some kind of physical thing is happening as a product of this operational technology doing its digital job. And more specifically, we have industrial control systems. And those are the very specific devices, not just the entire operational environment, not just the routed devices, the routers that are involved in sending traffic, and the switches that are involved in sending traffic to these devices, but specifically the devices that are doing industrial control. So we're talking about actuators and PLCs, the things that are actually making the decisions about what goes on and off and making it happen. And then finally, we have SCADA. And SCADA is used rather incorrectly when we're talking about industrial control systems. SCADA, what it actually is the control interface for all of this other stuff. It is not specifically making switches open and close. It is collecting lots of data from an OT environment and providing it to end users so they can do supervisory actions from a large distributed environment. So SCADA and ICS are not interchangeable terms. SCADA is more the administrative side where we're seeing the results of what's happening. We're monitoring. We're seeing temperatures go up and down across a large facility or multiple facilities. And ICS is the actual switches opening, relays opening and closing, breakers going off, etc. So to break that down to a more palatable example that people can wrap their heads around, I took a brewery. And something that most of us are familiar with to some extent. So in a brewery, you have IoT devices. You have security cameras. You have potentially building wireless thermostats, wireless speakers, all the kinds of things that go into a work environment that are connected to Wi-Fi. Maybe the brewery people have a PlayStation, whatever. So there's tons and tons of IoT devices in that environment. The OT network, that's the operational technology network, is all of the network that goes into running the brewery. It's the Cisco switches or the Juniper switches that are sitting on the rack and routing traffic to the devices. It's the servers that go into providing data and collecting data and storing it. And then it's also all of the ICS stuff. And the ICS stuff includes like actuators and controllers that make the heat in the tanks go on or shut it off when they're warm enough. And the sensor on that tank that says the temperature is correct or it's not correct. And then SCADA is that office up at the top of the brewery where the people who work there are monitoring everything that's going on. They're making decisions about whether there's failures in the system, whether there's things they need to correct. And they've got screens in front of them and they're looking at output from all of this other stuff. So let's talk about, so I've just described a very, very general network, and I've said ICS networks are made up of stuff, right? I said there's switches and actuators and sensors and relays. When we're talking about an ICS network, we talk about something called the Purdue model. Who has heard of the Purdue model in here? So like 2 people are raising their hands, and they're the ICS people I already know about. The Purdue model is an integral part of ICS. It's really, really important. Who's familiar with the OSI model in here in IT? Yeah, everybody raises their hand. So the OSI model in IT, as we're familiar with, is a representative model of how we think about telecommunications networks, from physical up to application layer, and if you want to add human layer on top of that. All the different layers of encapsulated stuff that go into forming a network and network communications. The Purdue model is a rather similar model. It's used to represent various functional areas of an ICS network. And it's really critical because it helps us think about security. So layer 0 of the Purdue model is the sensors and the motors, those physical things. If you were going to build a very, very simple electronic network that made heat go on and off, I mean, you'd have a switch and you'd have a thermostat. You'd have some physical things that are doing physical things in that device, in that network, to make heat go on and off. And then you have layers above that in the Purdue model. You have a bunch of different layers of ICS stuff, layer 0 up to layer 3. And then layer 3.5 is a DMZ that separates that from your normal operational corporate network. So you've got your ICS network, and in a good deployment, you have a actual DMZ inside your architecture of your corporate network that separates that ICS function from your normal IT functions, from your business network, from your finance, from your sales, from your day-to-day operational activities. And layer 4 is an abstracted cloud. If you think about your representation of a normal IT network, you have lots of stuff going on inside the network at multiple layers, and at the top of that, you have a abstracted cloud that represents the internet. We do the same thing with the Purdue model when we're talking about a ICS network, and that top of that Purdue model is a cloud representing your corporate network, the stuff that you really generally don't want connecting back into your ICS stuff. You don't want to have your sales guy able to make changes to an actuator on your ICS network. That's just totally inappropriate. So this is what the Purdue model looks like. I apologize that the screen's a little bit small, so you might have a little trouble looking at it across the room from the back. But like I mentioned, we start out at layer 0, and that's instrumentation, sensors, and motors. Then we move up to more digital technology like PLCs, RTUs, and relays, and we'll talk about what some of that stuff is more specifically in a minute. Then we get up to computer systems and alarm systems, more intelligent stuff inside the ICS network, and operator workstations. We get up to layer 3, which is basically the stuff that's doing more complex human-aided analysis and support of the ICS network. So the things that are logging, the things that are patching, doing reporting for any number of reasons. And then we hit that DMZ at level 3.5. So that's the DMZ separating your ostensibly sensitive ICS network from your corporate network. Obviously, this is ideal. And obviously, we have many cases out there in the world where this is not the ideal model and there's no DMZ in place. And this model isn't followed at all. This is an ideal scenario. This is representative of a lot of industries and of a lot of ICS deployments. And it's a good starting place to understand what ICS networks look like and talk about them. Okay. All right. So another way to look at this, and this is super tiny, so I don't think you guys are going to be able to see that from the back of the room, but again, we have our wide area network going down through these layers. We have the production network, which is actual physical stuff. We have the supervisory equipment, like the servers that are doing logging and reporting and monitoring, the SCADA stuff. And then we get up to the next layer, which is corporate IT. And so somewhere in the middle of that, we have our DMZ. And so there's multiple layers of defenses between the ICS network and the external internet. All right, so there's only so many things that can go wrong in a operational network. So think about this for a minute. Bear with me. You're thinking there's like, you can have something flood, you can have something go on fire, you're thinking of all these disaster scenarios, the things that can go wrong in industrial control and critical infrastructure systems. But it really breaks down to this. What are the 4 things that can go wrong on a physical operational network? Well, something can go on when it's not supposed to go on, or not go on when it's supposed to go on. It can go on for the wrong duration, and it can go on at the wrong time or not go on at the right time. So those are really the things that can go wrong in a network. We can abstract any operational problem down to that. One of those 4 things has gone wrong. And at the very base level, we want to make sure that every actuator in our industrial control network goes on when it's supposed to. It goes on for the right amount of time. It goes on at the right time, and it doesn't go on when it's not supposed to. And there's multiple components in any ICS network which are there to assure that those things happen. The devices that we use in various networks, again, verticals are very different. Power operates very differently than oil and gas, which operates very different from manufacturing, which operates very different from water treatment. They use different devices from different manufacturers. Different ICS manufacturers have a foothold in different verticals. But we see the same types of devices and the same types of functions which perform this basic thing in all of those different industries. So some things that we see in common ICS networks. First of all, we see HMIs. HMIs are human-machine interfaces. That's the screen that you look at. It tells you what's going on in your network. We're getting into SCADALand now. This is saying this is operating, this is not operating, this is your temperature, this is your pressure, et cetera, et cetera. You have multiple methods for controlling physical operational things like actuators and valves. You have distributed control systems, and you also have multiple devices on site like PLCs, which are programmable logic controllers. They are what you have pre-configured to do these operational things at set times with set inputs. They're pretty dumb other than the logic you provide them. but they are told when I receive X input, I do Y. Simple, generally Boolean logic. At this temperature, I shut off this actuator, et cetera, et cetera. We have RTUs, which essentially perform the same function by acting almost like a terminal server. They pipe data back to a central controller, which issues commands back. And then we have various types of physical controllers with limited digital function, microcontrollers, loop controllers that make sensors and actuators do things. So we've gone down the list from very technical human-controlled systems which are collecting digital data, all the way down to switches. And the important thing to note about that is that PLCs are programmed by simple logic, and that's based on very simple inputs, usually Boolean yes or no, or sensor data, looking at levels, looking at various conditionals in logic. And sensor output and telemetry may be also transmitted to a more intelligent SCADA system or DCS system, and a human may choose to monitor that on an HMI. And you're thinking about all these different layers. You have everything from a switch on and off to these complex digital systems, and they all have to talk to each other. So the communication of a very simple switch or actuator or sensor is very simple digital data. It's a number or an on-off state. Most of us are electronics people, and we can think about the type of output that you get from, say, a thermostat or a switch with a microcontroller on it that knows whether it's on or off, or it's in state 1 or state 0. So that's very, very simple traffic. But we have to next send that on to some type of PLC, which makes decisions based on that, and then also outputs data. And that sends out more complex data that says, I turn this off at this time based on this input. So then we've got a little bit more complex traffic. And then that goes on to like a DCS or some other kind of central control system, some type of SCADA system that makes very, very complex decisions based on what a system's doing in facility 1 and what a system's doing in facility 2. It conglomerates all that data and makes much more complex logical decisions. So that traffic's very, very complex because you're collecting historical data, you're collecting system status and diagnostic data. So we've gone from very, very simple digital signals that are saying things like on, off, yes, no, this is a temperature, et cetera, to very complex and sometimes very hefty historical and monitoring and logging data. And those types of communications have their place in the Purdue model. So the communication you see at layer 0, again, is like field bus, device net, HART, very basic serial communication, ones and zeros, simple traffic. And then we move to layer 1 where we have possibly to some of the people in this audience more familiar ICS traffic like Modbus. And that's a little bit more complex traffic. That's control traffic. That's telling things to go on and off. It's telling them to adjust. It's also got monitoring and diagnostic traffic. And then we move up to much more complex digital traffic at layer 2, like OPC, Ethernet-based protocols that are sending complex historical data and monitoring data. So at all these different Purdue levels, and again, I keep coming back to the Purdue model because it's so important to understanding ICS networks because we have devices at all these different layers. At each one of these layers, we see different protocols in use. So you're not necessarily just going to see one protocol in an ICS network. Some of the more fundamental protocols may be encapsulated inside other things, and almost everything is eventually going to be, in modern networks, encapsulated inside IP traffic. But you've got multiple layers of encapsulated traffic running across your network. And those different types of traffic are in different positions on the network, and they are also performing different functions. So you're not just dealing with one protocol like Modbus on most ICS networks. You're probably also seeing something like OPC. And if you look at the communication from individual devices, physical devices, you're probably seeing much more simple serial communication. So we've done our very, very short crash course in things you need to know about ICS and how ICS networks work. So let's talk a little bit about ICS hacking, because that's what you're all here for. You're security people and you're interested in how bad is it, what's getting hacked, what's happening out there right now. So let's start. The history of famous big name ICS hacks is about 10 years old. And I choose to start at the Aurora generator test. And if you want to see something fun right now, pick up your phones and go into YouTube, open your YouTube app and type in Aurora generator test, and you can watch a generator explode while I'm up here yakking at you. So the Aurora generator test was Idaho National Laboratories said, we have all these critical infrastructure systems out there on the web, and it'd be really bad if they got hacked. So what are some ways that they could get physically damaged by a hacker coming in and doing something digital remotely? And so they conducted this test. They got a generator and they said, what happens if we switch the relay on this generator on and off super, super fast? Can we knock it out of phase with the rest of the grid? And indeed they could. Yes, I see some people nodding their heads and hopefully some people looking at their phones and watching this generator explode. Yes, they in fact did manage to make a generator explode using entirely digital input. And that was kind of groundbreaking and eye-opening for a lot of people who don't think paranoid security thoughts like we do. Because this is somebody sitting there with a computer and they just made this massive generator explode. Oh, look, you're watching it. That's nice. Okay. Yes, so that was kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people in government, and that's really where I want to start talking about the history of attacks, because things just kind of escalated from there. Everybody else was like, oh yeah, we can make stuff explode. This is great. And of course, everybody here has probably heard of Stuxnet. I almost don't want to talk about it because it's such the cliche ICS attack to talk about. And Stuxnet was interesting for numerous reasons. First of all, the attack vector against a isolated network, and the fact that it was a prototypical ICS attack which involved in-depth technical knowledge of the system being targeted. And it was ahead of its time in a way, because yes, Stuxnet had some very fundamental problems in the way it was designed and deployed. But still, we saw that very specific subject matter expertise in a very specific targeted system. So obviously that was huge news, although its impact was fairly limited. The next thing that we saw was Habex or Dragonfly 1.0. The Dragonfly designators are a little misleading. There's a lot of contention about attribution in the ICS space still. There's a small number of actor groups that are really targeting ICS. And there's a tendency in our industry to try to attribute things to one group because they're kind of the same and we are looking for nation state attribution when that's probably not wise or accurate. So anyway, we have Dragonfly 1.0, and 1.0 was doing espionage. It was we talked about those protocols a minute ago. We said OPC is one of those higher level on the Purdue model protocols that collects complex data about system operation and troubleshooting, diagnostics, and historical data. So OPC has a lot of visibility into an ICS network. It's also used across many, many platforms, many, many vendor devices. And so it was a great choice for this particular threat actor to choose to go out there on the internet and start scoping out ICS networks. So they used a rat, and they used the very common OPC protocol to go out across wide swaths of industries and organizations in multiple countries and just start seeing what was out there. And they were conducting espionage, they were looking at how things operated, they were looking at what was deployed in various environments, and OPC was awesome for that. And then we saw Black Energy too, and that actually used a little bit more exploitation. It was also conducting reconnaissance and espionage, but it was exploiting internet-facing and internet-connected human-machine interfaces. So remember you talked about like SCADA and HMI as being those screens that people look at? So just getting like a screenshot of an HMI, it provides immense amounts of data to an adversary. So if they can get on that internet-connected HMI and get a picture of it, they suddenly know what vendors in use. They kind of know what the state of the system is. It probably has some very interesting status indicators on it. So that was a wonderful way to collect data across multiple U.S. organizations. So again, we see espionage reconnaissance using kind of common ICS things. And then we had Black Energy 3. And Black Energy 3 actually caused physical damage. It caused a massive power outage in Ukraine. And the kind of alarming thing was this was really not a malware-driven attack. It was more of a human-driven attack, which is, obviously we all know that living off the land is much harder to detect in operational environments than just a bunch of brand new malware that our antivirus might pick up. In Black Energy 3, we saw an adversary gain a foothold on an IT network, get past that ICS DMZ, and then a human being ostensibly sat there and analyzed the system, spent a long time doing reconnaissance, learned the structure of the network, and then they dropped Kill Disk, which essentially destroyed multiple systems inside the ICS environment. And they also bricked the serial to Ethernet adapters in the network that they were targeting. So between those two things, bricking systems and bricking the serial to Ethernet adapters used to communicate with serial devices in this Ukrainian power plant, they caused about 6 hour power outage, and then they destroyed the ability of the operators of this plant to do remote automated management. Everything had to be done manually for months after that. So it was incredibly destructive and disruptive. And that was one of the first times we saw like a human being going out there and thinking about ways and spending time doing reconnaissance and then launching attack based on the specific infrastructure of a operational environment. Of course, we have crash override. Again, that was targeted against Ukraine. Power grid. That was more of a reconnaissance and espionage action. We saw staging occur. Again, we saw OPC used because it's a very common protocol and very well documented. And we saw extensive reconnaissance against HMIs. So crash override looked rather like staging for a future attack for multiple reasons. More recently, we saw Dragonfly 2.0. And again, like the previous Dragonfly attack, although attribution to the same party is debatable, we saw reconnaissance and espionage of multiple energy firms in the US and Europe. Again, we see people going across the internet, going across many different operational environments, collecting data about them, looking at systems, seeing what's deployed, and potentially staging for a future attack. And finally, we have Trisis. And Trisis was alarming for a couple reasons. First of all, Trisis was the first malware we saw specifically targeting safety instrumentation systems. And why that's concerning, this is something I had to wrap my head around as a traditional IT person. The problem with this is when we think about a power plant getting hacked, to an IT person that might seem like, well, people are going to die if the power goes out. You know, you're going to have your 911 system's going to have trouble, and the power to like streetlights are going to go out. Ambulances are going to be delayed. People are going to die. But that's really not the way to think about it, because an adversary has two choices there. They can bring down the power, which may, by proxy, kill people, or they can target the safety systems inside the plant, which keep the operators inside the plant alive. And that is a direct attack on human life. Because as opposed to a power outage, which is, infrastructure disruptive and may down the line result in injury or loss of life, targeting a safety instrumentation system is a purposeful attack and not only damaging the plant, but causing harm to the operators who work there. So Trisis was very alarming, just for the audacity of intending to potentially or preparing to kill the operators in a power plant. So what does this all mean? All this stuff I've told you. Probably nothing good. I've used a couple terms over and over again in this description, this very brief description of the history of ICS attacks, and that's reconnaissance and espionage. We've seen multiple broad sweeping attacks against multiple countries, multiple verticals and industries that are collecting data. They're collecting data. What's out there? What vendors are in use? How are they deployed? What's facing the internet? We've seen staging in multiple attacks too. ICS attacks tend to take a long time. You have to do a lot of reconnaissance because deployments are so different in different environments. That's why the grid as a whole isn't really at risk, because each part of the grid is totally different, has totally different architecture. And we're gradually seeing more and more intelligent attacks using this data. Shodan's out there. It's not really a great help to advanced adversaries who already have intelligence, but it certainly increases the potential for non-technical adversaries to attack ICS systems. Yeah, we've seen more IT network malware affecting ICS, like ransomware, which is disruptive even if it's not intended to bring down ICS networks or even targeted against them. All ICS components are susceptible to compromise, and not all of them are probably desirable targets for adversaries, since it's so resource and time intensive to launch ICS attacks. However, they may use any environment for research and testing purposes. There's a lot out there, and we don't know a lot of the stuff that's out there because we have such a small pool of attacks and adversary information to look at. We see a lot of staging going on, and some of this is waiting for the other shoe to drop and see what they do with it. Build up the best defenses we can and try to train people on ICS the best we can before those pieces of data that have been collected are used to launch attacks. So there's some basic misconceptions about ICS versus IT networks. I picked 8 of them. First of all, ICS protocols are inherently complex. Not necessarily. Some of them are very simple serial data. I don't understand how this ICS system works, so I can't do ICS security. We talked about earlier the 4 ways any system can fail that's doing physical stuff. Once you understand that, you can start breaking the systems down into those types of failures and understand what can possibly go wrong. ICS networks are less complex than IT networks. No, they're full of tons of components. ICS devices have no available defenses. That's not true either. They're not just sitting out there waiting to get attacked by Nmap. There are firewalls on ICS networks. ICS device security is improving. Any ICS network can be brought down by Nmap or Shodan. Again, that's not true. There really are security devices that are deployable on ICS networks that are hardened for ICS environments. Adversaries have the upper hand. Not necessarily. They have to collect tons of information to launch an attack. The whole US grid could go down next week. Probably not. It's, again, so disparate and broken into different parts that don't talk to one another that launching an attack against the entire grid would imply an immense concerted effort by huge amounts of teams. That doesn't mean that an entire city couldn't be brought down. Every attack in an industrial organization is preparation for a kinetic attack. No, they get infected with ransomware too. They are vulnerable to the same types of IT malware and attacks that everybody else is. What's the same? OT network and server infrastructure vendors are the same. We still use Cisco switches, Juniper switches, Dell servers, HP servers. We still have to have PCAPs, or it didn't happen. We still need to know how to write good signatures, even more so with custom protocols. Systems are often primary and secondary targets of advanced adversaries using very similar APT tactics that we see on IT networks. Commodity malware happens and humans happen. Human users still do dumb stuff like plug in USB drives with their family photos. What's different for you guys? You're going to have to deal with tunneled ICS protocols. You're going to have to learn all those different layers of protocols. You're going to see many more restrictions on downtime, scanning, and tool usage. These environments are very concerned with uptime and not bringing down operational systems. You have to understand how the ICS environments work to some level. You have to understand the basics of how a power plant works or a water treatment plant works. You will see lots of proprietary technology that has either massive binders of documentation to go through or absolutely nothing available to you because it's legacy and old. Everything that goes wrong in an ICS network requires a IR investigation. You're going to be dealing with very, very old technology because the life cycle of ICS technology is much longer than our ICS life cycles. So you're going to see very legacy stuff. And you're going to have very strict personal protective equipment and safety training requirements to go on these sites. Finally, you're going to need to understand that the ICS kill chain involves many more steps than the IT kill chain. You also have to understand ICS technology and build malware targeted at specific devices. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark.
Thank you. So looking at some of the challenges in ICS networks, some of the issues that we run into as an industry trying to get better at security in general. One, a lot of our customers deal with very large geographical footprints. And you can kind of think of IT facing this as well. If we think of like Target, including all of the regional stores, that's very large. However, each regional store is generally responsible for some of its security. If we think of a windmill or a wind farm, they span multiple fields in multiple states, even up into Canada or other countries. And it's common for a wind farm to organize each linear row of turbines into a ring network. And so you have multiple ring networks in one field. If there's a switch that's aggregating that traffic, and say we're sending that to a central source, we run into network address translation issues if that switch is doing NATing. And monitoring each one of those individual assets is very, very difficult. If we think of IT like full packet capture solutions, you need a 1U or 2U rack. It's not practical to think that we're going to deploy that at every ring network across a wind farm. Managing the assets is also very difficult because of this topology. So we're not dealing with Linux, Mac, Windows. We can't deploy an EDR solution, endpoint detection response solution like Tanium or ECAT. And a key risk that we're facing generally across all industries is vendor access. So if I own a wind farm and I need to buy some widget that does X, I go to a vendor. It's really common for the warranty or contract to require that that vendor has connectivity to that device and direct connectivity. If, as an asset owner, I put something in line, they may void the warranty. So I've seen this specifically. A vendor will put an access wireless point on top of a turbine, funnel all of their traffic out to the internet. Essentially, that bridges the networks. So in an ideal world, if I'm an asset owner and I go to this vendor and I sign this contract and they bridge my network, I'm going to document it, I'm going to monitor it, but that isn't always the case. These networks were stood up decades ago. So somewhat of a joke that every time we hear, well, our ICS network is air-gapped. Well, sure, it may be, except for all of the vendor connections that are going out. And unless you're doing monitoring at each one of those ring networks, you would never see that traffic. It doesn't go through your central aggregation source and out through your IT network. And also anomaly detections. There's been some contested arguments in IT and ICS on the value of anomaly detection. I think it's a misconception to think that ICS networks are static. Yes, you get it working and then you don't touch it. The issue is that ICS networks are very dynamic in their behavior and operation. If we think of Stuxnet, all Stuxnet did was change the rotation speed on certain components in the reactor core. And that slight rotation speed increase and decrease caused a failure. If we think of a wind farm, we now have, I just learned about this a month ago, we still have people manning watchtowers with binoculars. And if they see a certain migratory bird come so close within the wind farm or turbines, they will shut them down. So that's an unprompted shutdown of multiple ring networks of turbines. That would be an anomaly in any system. Sure, we could get some context and say it came from a trusted device, it was done by an authorized user, but that's not enough confidence to really ignore it as an anomaly. So what do you need to know to get into ICS, to become the Lesley of ICS? I think really in IT in general, or any security practice, if it's incident response or red teaming, whatever, you really need 3 buckets of knowledge: host forensics, network forensics, and file analysis, or reverse engineering. I know very few people that are a master in all 3. Generally, there's a specialization, but you have to be proficient in all 3. And ICS is no different, with some caveats. On the host side, again, we're not dealing with common operating systems. A lot of custom hardware, proprietary firmware, and the first step in analyzing any device like this is to read the manual. RTFM, for sure, because even interacting with the device, I may not know. This first controller came from a wind turbine, and I see it has 7 RJ45 ports. That doesn't mean I can plug an Ethernet cable into it and start interacting with the device. These may not do TCP over IP, maybe some weird flavor of serial. Some of them only push egress communication. Inside the device, it's common to see just electrical, either completed or broken circuits to use as monitoring. So it may not use any data over that port at all. So interacting with the device, if it doesn't have a RJ45 port or a serial port, how can I interact with it? How can I push firmware to it or modify the behavior? Some, I can't modify the behavior at all. And doing forensics on these, I can't just load Encase Enterprise or FTK Imager. A lot of times you have to break the hardware open and get a copy of the memory or logs directly off the flash device, which will break the device. So host analysis is very different. File analysis is somewhat the same. I put IDAPRO up here, but there are many others. But we're not just dealing with executables, Python scripts, and batch scripts. We're dealing primarily with custom firmware, or .cfg, custom configuration files, .bin files, but the thought process is still the same. Network analysis, very similar. If you're dealing with new protocols, let's start with the protocol schematic. I think I'm pointing, but I'm not. Start with the protocol schematic so you can figure out what it looks like. How is data transferred? How is it logically organized? Flow diagram if one's available. So very similar to IT where we have host, file, network, but in ICS you also have to understand the industry. And that's because, as Lesley said, a petrochemical plant is very different from a wastewater treatment or a wind farm, and understanding the impact of that device on the network is crucial. If HMIs are generally installed on Windows servers, let's say a Windows server running an HMI has adware on it. Impacts are very low. If I start doing analysis on that and I bring that device down, the impact to the plant is much greater than what the adware is. And the risk of causing impact in addition or that supersedes the original incident is a real risk. Additionally, private industry is privately owned. Infrastructure is privately owned. And, but it's heavily regulated by the government. So some networks, like a nuclear control reactor, everything at level 0 is a critical asset. A cable, RJ45 port into the wall, everything. If I go in and interact with any of those devices without a slew of work orders, that company will be fined heavily by NERC SIP requirements. Those fines go into the millions of dollars. So doing analysis on any ICS network, you have to understand what you're working with. So some hurdles that you'll run into as you start learning. One is access to hardware and documentation. A lot of ICS controllers, even if it's a small widget, can be tens of thousands of dollars. If you have the money and go to the vendor to buy it, they may not sell it to you. Schneider Electric has hardware in the electrical grid across the US. Do they want to sell a security researcher that same equipment who's potentially going to break it open and expose all types of vulnerabilities? No. A lot of the documentation is hard to come by under the same regard. They just don't want to share the information. Some caveats to that. you can get quite a bit from the protocols. If you can get a PCAP sample, a lot of times you can decipher some information about the device. And that's from some experience. So generally, most protocols have a header field. Inside of that header, one field that's always present is a content length. Okay. Content length, header, so you can try to decipher certain fields within that. I was told 1 minute, so we'll cruise along here. A lot of proprietary protocols, a lot of the ICS community. Superseding. I'm going to trust Lesley on this one. A lot of proprietary protocols, a lot of security through obscurity. So again, if you can't find documentation on it, a lot of times you can get some samples. If you run into proprietary protocols, chances are you're doing an investigation on that device. If you're trying to get your feet wet and learn, stick to those that are well documented, like DMP3, Modbus, BACnet, and few shoulders to stand on. The community is very small. Those people that can do true ICS forensics, it's very small, and because of that, if you're looking around for documentation and hardware, you may not find it simply because it doesn't exist. No one has done it yet. Caveat there is that the community is very welcoming. We understand that we need the support, and we're very motivated and passionate. Not downplaying IT at all. Lesley and I both did IT forensics for a number of years. But if a vendor gets hacked and they lose 2 million credit card numbers, that's very bad. Not downplaying that. But the consequences are different than a hospital being hacked or the electric grid coming down like in Ukraine. Anytime the potential ramifications or repercussions involve loss of life, it's escalated. So the community is very passionate about it and very welcoming. This bullet is to make everyone feel good. That a lot of times, if you look around, there's no data out there. Like I said, maybe it just hasn't been done. And you can do it. If you put forth the effort, write a blog or a white paper, whatever, chances are a week later, a year later, we'll be doing some investigation and use your work to help us along. So I think the fact it doesn't exist yet, or it hasn't been done yet, really opens the door for you guys to do it. I say you guys, so I don't have to. So formal education resources, SANS has a lot of classes out there, more and more dedicated to ICS. They have lots of other content that is applicable, like threat intelligence or security essentials that transfer over. DHS, Idaho National Laboratory, and ICS CERT all co-fund a blue red team exercise. This training is free. It runs for 5 days. The reasons why this training is free is because it's hands-on equipment. So 4 days you're in a lab. The last day, you're doing a blue red team exercise. So if you're the red team, you can hack into a camera system, move cameras around, see the blue team. If you successfully compromise things, you can point the cameras at a wall and see water move in pipes, valves open and close. It is free, but it is targeted towards federal employees and asset owners. Dragos, we have a training like some other vendors out there with the same intent on getting hands-on an actual PLC, writing the ladder logic that will be flashed to this device to do some physical change. Our training is also free, but again, we target towards asset owners. Some universities are coming out with workshops and classes. I haven't seen an accredited university have a degree offered in it yet, but not to say it won't come. Self-study, YouTube is great. One caveat I'll say, don't search for hacking nuclear control center. It's a lot of media sensation and flashy marketing material. Instead, Google the components of that network or how a wind turbine works. There are great walkthroughs that will show that. Some conferences, this one included. Hardware-wise, virtualize whatever you can. There are a lot of kits out there, Raspberry Pi, Somebody Works, and some others, and also eBay. So if I'm reading the Trisis report, I know that malware focused on Triconic systems. If I just look on eBay, I can find a lot of Triconic's hardware. This device is $1,200, so they aren't cheap. One ethical point here is a lot of times doing this, you will find SSH certificate keys, VPN credentials, proprietary data from the company, and so on. So use your morals to guide how you handle that information. Generally, it's because either the device was stolen or it just wasn't properly sanitized. What am I looking at? 5? 1? None?
-0.
I don't give a shit. I'm going on. Leslie mentioned Shodan. There are self-encompassing virtual machines out there. Parrot and Kali are targeted to offense, Sift and Remnux to forensics. Firmware is available on a lot of vendors' websites. So if you go out to Schneider, file equals bin, download, chances are you'll find some. A lot of frameworks targeted to ICS. The screenshot down here is just Metasploit that's installed on Kali. Just doing a search for SCADA. There's quite a bit of material. So tips, you still have to understand the fundamentals of computing. How electronics share data. We're not dealing with common operating systems, but you still have to understand how they work. Don't be afraid to break things. Don't break the important things. See what others broke. And this is the best point of advice I could give to anyone in ICS or IT security. Learn to learn quickly. There are so many protocols, so many hardware devices out there. It's going through the motion, the methodology that's important. That's why at the slide we don't have one slide on learn these protocols or learn these hardware devices. It just isn't practical. So let's say you know the fundamentals of computing. You want to go out there and get a feel for what it's like to work in ICS from a forensic standpoint. Get sleep and coffee. Go download a free virtualization software. VMware Player is free. VirtualBox is free. Go download some VMs. I would get some forensics flavor like Sift or Remnux, an offensive flavor like Kali. A lot of people say, well, I don't have a Windows license. Windows makes available a lot of virtual machines for free. They're targeted for web developers, so they have Internet Explorer versions or Microsoft Edge. They expire after 90 days, but in the guidance for downloading these, Microsoft will even tell you, take a snapshot so you can revert it back. And then go find a blog that someone wrote up. Linksys and Netgear devices have been broken apart multiple times. Go find a blog on one of these that has some attainable hardware. Go to Best Buy, buy it, you're out $100, maybe 150, and break the device. Analyze the firmware, root it back, play around, see what you can do. Use the blog or the write-up as a sample answer key. It's a good experience on working at that hardware level, seeing what firmware can do, how it's different from HAL and Windows and so on. What you do from there, I don't know. Make a bunch of money. So some references, I'm sure everyone can see this. Yeah, we'll leave it up. You can take a picture with your phone. Essentially, if you Google the keywords, you're going to get it. There is a lot of marketing hype. Media and news agencies love to inflate stories. It's not a value. It's not going to teach you anything. Focus on the important stuff. So yeah, we'll leave this up. Otherwise, any questions? Do we have time for questions?
Do you have questions out there or while we're setting up then?
No time for questions. One reference I didn't put up here, Lesley and I enjoy adult beverages, and it is a great segue to ask further questions, so we'll hang outside there afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you.